Simple as that.
The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig.
Well, thank you everybody for coming to the Owl Bookshop, and thank you very much to the Owl Bookshop for having us. This is a sort of a hybrid one because this is also Books Podcast, and with your permission, we will be recording it for the podcast as well. But obviously, the main event is here right now.
He was responsible for changing the course of popular music. The Mersey sound only existed because of Brian. He confessed to me that he masturbated 12 times a day. He regarded the Beatles as his children. The things he did for the Beatles, no other manager had ever done or would ever do.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
I wanted to start by making a point about biographers. You want basically three things out of a biographer. You'd like him to be completely on top of his material. That'd be great. It would be very nice if he had a real insight into the character and the times of the subjects he's writing about. And it doesn't hurt if he writes like an angel. And that brings us to Philip Norman, why we're here, for his new book, Mr. Moonlight, Brian Epstein and the Making of the Beatles. Now, before we start, I have to say, I've just said Epstein, and I've heard people recently, I think I've heard you say Epstein.
Well, he said Epstein himself.
Who, Brian did?
He insisted on Epstein, yeah.
Then I've been saying it wrong for 50 years.
You'll catch up.
Well, it's a good thing you were here, Philip, otherwise I could go on being wrong. In the book, you say that without Brian Epstein, there is no Beatles as we know them. And that's not hyperbole, is it?
No. Well, Brian, without any there was no rule book for being a pop star's manager when Brian came along. And he had no experience whatsoever in such things. And when you measure his achievement, it is simply jaw-dropping. First of all, he was responsible through what he called his boys for changing the course of popular music, for making popular music no longer just blue-collar music, as it had been since the rock and roll 50s when people, having a good time was indivisible from smashing up a cinema. He made it possible for middle-class kids to love the Beatles and therefore become Beatlemaniacs. In the end, even the aristocracy and even royalty. Not only that, he altered the perception of Britain in the world. If you think back, anybody who can think back that far to the 1950s, Britain was viewed as just clapped out, irrelevant. Its only sort of product in the artistic line seemed to be the angry young men who were just saying what a shithole it was. After Brian, everybody in the world wanted to come to Britain, wanted to come to London, wanted to be swinging. That was Brian. That was all Brian. And for all of this, he never got one single bit of public recognition at all, not even a thank you. So part of my motivation in writing this book is really, although the Beatles are with us, it seems, eternally, Brian is somehow overlooked. Brian tends to be not a name that people recognize. Even today, you may not know this, but towards the end of the month, there's something called Global Beatles Day, which roughly commemorates, it's not an exact anniversary, but it commemorates the One World satellite broadcast in 1967, when the Beatles played to how many billions of people, uncounted. In none of the publicity for Global Beatle Day is Brian's name mentioned. So he really does need to be appreciated far more than he is today. That is an extraordinary record of achievement for a young man who unfortunately died at the age of 32. What he might have done, who can tell?
He went around promising everybody that the Beatles were going to be bigger than Elvis and was laughed at for obvious reasons, which is real vision, because even Beatles couldn't have dreamed that big.
Well, of course, they thought, this is extraordinary to sort of realize, but they thought throughout their career, right up to the very end, that they were going to be superseded at any moment by another pop group. This is why Lennon and McCartney wrote songs and gave them away to other people. They thought they would have to be earning their living as songwriters, not as performers. And the only sort of measure of incalculable fame was Elvis Presley. But in the end, they were bigger than any earthly instrument could measure. They were indescribably huge. And
I want to investigate this a bit more, though, because, I mean, the master plan for the Beatles, as you say in the book, took no account of John and Paul's prolific songwriting genius. So Brian saw them as bigger than Elvis. On what grounds? I mean, he couldn't have imagined Sergeant Pepper. Or...
Well, of course, that was hubris at the time, because they weren't bigger than Lee Curtis and the All Stars, or. And it was hubris, and it sort of popped out once, and he thought he would have reason to regret having said it. But then, of course, in fact, Elvis was never that big in songwriting, so it was just swank to begin with, but in the end, it exceeded reality.
I think people don't understand how big the Beatles were if they weren't around at the time. I mean, we've had big pop. I saw something recently. Somebody was suggesting that Michael Jackson was the most famous pop star of all time, and I can't help thinking, you just don't know. You have no frame of reference if you don't know what Beatlemania was.
You see, Brian had this intuition, amazing intuition, which made him very, very successful in running the family record business, gramophone record business. They also did appliances. In those days, the consumer society, a Creed washing machine was almost as glamorous as a pop star. But Brian thought the same. Brian thought that they might be superseded. And that was why he had them shackled to this terrible work schedule of 2 albums a year and God knows how many tours and all of that sort of thing. So Brian had no inkling of how big it would get. And then, of course, after the terrible, tragic, useless, pointless death of John Lennon, that was then came a second wave, which is still with us, because they never really officially broke up. And through the 70s, people were always half expecting them to come back. But of course, then they couldn't.
We have to talk about Brian's family background because, of course, you've written about Brian Epstein in the other books that you've written about the Beatles, but you go much more into his family background, into his personality. So let's talk about the Epsteins just a little bit. And the the thing that struck me, which I've never quite realised, is how rich they were. Brian was denied nothing.
No, I mean, they were what used to be called well-to-do. I mean, they worked very, very...
Bought him a horse.
Yeah, they did buy it. They bought him a horse, yes. That was no easy thing to have in Liverpool. And where would you...
Except at Aintree.
Except at Aintree. No, poor horse never had to go over to Beecher's Brook, thank God. But no, he had every sort of comfort, and they were very, very fond parents, and very nice parents, of course. But his great grandfather was from Lithuania, and they worked really, really hard for what they had, and they had a very, very good business, and they were very quick to latch on to the two great sort of expressions of the consumer society. The 1960s. If you remember when people started buying after dinner mints, even if they didn't have dinner, they still bought after dinner mints. They also it was appliances. It was like Goblin Teasmaids and things like that. It was pop records, and so they were well to the fore in that. So, and Brian's instinct was very good, even though he was a classical music buff. He'd only ever liked up to the time he met the Beatles one pop record, and that was Little Richard's Babyface.
Little Richard was pretty good.
I will say this actually, a piece of absolute egoism. He once sang it to me down the phone.
Little Richard?
Yes. Must be dreaming. Yeah. Yes. And went on to Bamalama Bamaloo after that.
Before he went into the family business, and we can talk about that as well, but he had quite a lot of false starts.
He did, although he made too much of them. In fact, he portrayed himself, and indeed his family thought he was a failure until the Beatles started being really big. He was never really a failure. He did national service, but he was a very, very good clerk in the RASC. He used to dress up as an officer to go around the vicinity and into the in and outs.
Even though he wasn't an officer.
Even though he wasn't an officer.
But again, he was rich, so he could come back from his leave wearing a fancy coat in a chauffeur-driven car, and then they'd salute him as he came.
Yes, but that was the trouble, of course. That was called impersonating an officer. Yeah. Yes, and that really started his rather quick exit from the army, but because the army had sort of worked out that he was gay, which you could not be, of course, in the services in those days. And he then wanted to be an actor, and he became a rather old drama student at RADA. But in fact, one of his main tutor there said he was very promising.
And yet, then he got into trouble, and this is one of those ironies, isn't it? He was prosecuted for cottaging, for soliciting other men at public lavatories. Except he hadn't done it.
That's right. It was a police trap. He was going home to his dibs. He had to, he had to wear a duff. He tried to be a student. He tried to wear a duffel coat. He'd never worn a duffel coat before. Had to leave his nice car in Liverpool. But he got off the tube at Swiss Cottage and exchanged a glance with a young man, possibly. He did actually went into the loo just to relieve himself. And as he walked away, he was surrounded by police or plane. It was a honey trap, but he was taken away and charged. And that really ruined the theatre for him and ruined London for him.
That's the point, isn't it? Because he didn't have to give up RADA. He then decided that he was going to, run away from it, I suppose.
That's right. It was all to do with this horrible incident where he was, the charge sheet said that he had importuned, this used to be the quaint word for cottaging, he had importuned several men. By the time it got into court, it said he'd importuned 7 men. But he was still told that he'd better to plead guilty, which he did. And he never got back to Liverpool.
He has to, I was going to say, at which point he has to give his father's phone number.
Yeah.
So it didn't get back to Liverpool.
No, because it was only reported in the local paper, the Ham and High.
And nobody did call his dad.
No. Yeah.
But his father did become aware of his homosexuality when he was back in Liverpool, when there was a blackmailing case.
Yes, I mean, this was horrible. He was you could not have met a more gentle, cultured, cultivated person. But there was something about, there was a streak of masochism that just made him go out in search of young, straight men in the most unwise place you could imagine, which was Liverpool Docks. And quite often, most people didn't recognize him as the manager of this record store during the day, this record department in the NEM store. But an older man did recognize him and started blackmailing him. And in fact, even the police had to be brought into it. Of course, you can imagine the attitude of the police and how sympathetic they were to this. And in fact, on the famous occasion when the Beatles go to his office at the NEM store for a meeting, the first meeting with Brian, it's the same place where just a couple of months earlier, the police had been hiding behind the washing machines and the spin dryers, waiting to pounce on this blackmailer.
And he always imagined the Beatles didn't know he was.
He imagined it. Of course, they knew. And by then, they'd been to Hamburg, and
Yes.
they'd seen Hamburg. But they were worldly young men, but that was his delusion. He just deluded himself. They didn't, as he put it, find out.
You say in the book that in the early days, the Beatles accepted Brian's sexuality as the price of what he could do for them. And later that acceptance would become a sort of measure of their affection and ultimately compassion. It wasn't a big deal for them.
It wasn't a big deal for them, but it was a vulnerability that John Lennon would exploit.
Yeah, John Lennon was not always a delightful and sensitive man. He was unkind.
Sometimes he was totally delightful and sensitive, and sometimes he could be awful.
Yes.
And so he would allude to this.
What did he say when Brian asked him what his autobiography should be called?
How do you like to say it? Queer Jew.
Yes, which is must have crushed. Well, it did. We know that it did because Brian was constantly crushed by the unkind things, Lennon said.
But you have to realize as well that this is a time of the sort of cultural stone age in this country, where homosexual sexual acts between consensual men were crimes, with a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. And the anti-Semitism that we see sickeningly on the rise now was much, much worse. And Brian felt it right up until the moment when he seemed to have everything in the world. He would still hear the most horrible things said in his earshot about his being Jewish. I'll tell you this one because it is just such a measure that the absolute horror. He was having lunch in the Mirabelle with Jeffrey Ellis, who's an old friend and later employee. Lawrence Harvey was walking out of the restaurant and turned around casually as he passed Brian's table and said, "I didn't know they let queers in here now." That is just utterly hideous. And that was happening all the time.
Is it fair to say, though, that he made heavier weather of his sexual orientation? There are many gay men in the book. There are other pop impresarios, Larry Parnes, and there's Joe Meek, and there are theatrical there are actors and things. Many of whom had perfectly happy, if concealed, gay lives.
Yes,
Brian tended not to have a happy
on the upper level, there were sort of major figures in the entertainment business who did have stable gay long-term relationships, but by and large, there were a lot of gay men on the lower levels as well. The best known was Larry Parnes, who was well known for his so-called stable of young men. Larry Parnes' office were opposite Boy Scout headquarters on the Cromwell Road. And he would study through powerful binoculars the Boy Scouts as they came and went. And in fact, I did talk to a very charming man who used to give all these names, these nom de guerre. And a boy called Roy Taylor from Leicester was named by Larry Parnes Vince Eager. There was always a kind of sexual subtest.
Homoerotic overtone.
Yes.
To the name.
And Vince had to. The ones who came from out of town had to stay at Parnes' flat. And Vince Eager always kept this small antique table as a shield.
to fend him off.
Yes,
because he was predatory, Larry Parnes.
Absolutely predatory, as you are.
I mean, what we mostly are, us Beatles anoraks, is that Larry Parnes was managing a kid called Johnny Gentle.
And Dickie Pride.
And Dickie Pride. But the Beatles wound up backing Johnny Gentle on a short tour of Scotland.
Yes, it was a very short tour of Scotland and not much of a backing job. But anyway, Johnny Gentle was because there were pop singers from Liverpool before the Beatles, and Larry Parnes had actually happened on a few of them. Another one was Billy Fury. He was called Billy Fury. He was absolutely catatonically shy. Yes. He was still known as Billy Fury. And then Marty Wilde was the most affable person you could ever meet. So there was no sort of study of their characters before these.
It's a good thing he never got hold of the Beatles, rechristened them.
And in fact, Brian, towards the end, when Brian was, having a lot of trouble with pills, did try to get Larry Parnes to come into partnership with him. Because there was nobody like Brian. They would not have accepted anybody but Brian.
We're jumping ahead, but eventually he brought Robert Stigwood into the organisation, and I don't know if you're all familiar with Robert Stigwood. He was a terrible man. He was deeply dishonest, and it was a terrible mistake for Brian to get into bed. And no, that's the one thing. For Brian to form a commercial arrangement with it.
Yes, Robert Stigwood once promoted a tour by the Rolling Stones, and Keith Richard. Just started because he hadn't paid the Stones. Keith Richards started to hit him and kick him. And great PR man, Keith Altham, who recently just passed away, unfortunately, just said, Keith, why do you keep hitting him? Keith, he keeps getting up. But of course, he was very big later on in relating movies to pop music.
Oh, yes, Saturday Night Fever.
The Bee Gees.
All those.
And Grease and all of those, yeah.
The other keynote to Brian's unhappiness, at any rate, is the anti-Semitism, and You've got quite a catalogue of occasions and ways in which Brian was snubbed because he was Jewish.
Well, it was that stealthy sort of British anti-Semitism, which is often only felt by the victim. And there were lots of occasions when, like after, they played for the Royal Command performance, and Brian was the only one of the sort of showmakers in the lineup who wasn't there,
To shake the Queen Mother's hand.
Yes.
Everybody else did.
Yes. Later on, when Princess Margaret married a photographer, then he it was okay. They were more bohemian. But you just have this feeling all the time of discrimination against Brian. When there's a special television show about just the Mersey sound only existed because of Brian. And he was absolutely the right person to present this show. It was Pete Murray, the DJ. And all through, there are these moments where you can feel this sort of poisonous breath somehow.
Harold Wilson organises MBEs for the Beatles and for services to music. And if anybody has made any contribution, but Brian's not even invited to the palace.
Not even, no, he goes. He hitches a ride in the limo and waits outside while they're getting their MBEs. And then later on, of course, there are other moments when he could have, this would have been a good moment for him to receive some honour. He got nothing at all.
He's only 32, but his whole life he was never sort of admitted into the establishment.
Well, no. And, he was, obviously, pop music took a lot of emancipating. And the Beatles, of course, were hugely instrumental in that because of Brian. Because the one thing that Brian did, which was so clever, was without in any way adulterating the Beatles' sound or their personalities, he gave them an air of refinement. And in that second album, the first album shows them all looking down from a EMI headquarters from a balcony, sort of four hard-boiled scousers. The camera doesn't particularly love them. The next one, with the Beatles, they're all looking like art students. They're all their faces in half shadow, And that is a great moment about opening up pop music to every class, at every age, in fact.
And Brian's vision of how to present things was peerless.
It was, and he was very good. He was very, very good at display and doing their posters. So as soon as Brian represented them, these posters appeared all over Merseyside. The Beatles prior to European tour just meant they were going back to Hamburg to the strip clubs. And there was a great moment when he brought Little Richard, who I mentioned before, to Merseyside to top the bill at a place called the New Brighton Tower Ballroom. It was a replica there had been a tower there, but the ballroom was still there, this quilted huge space. And so it was the fact that he could put the Beatles second on the bill to Little Richard, which meant they were only a line of type away from being as big as Little Richard. But then someone who I knew very well, who was actually the only sort of stable gay relationship Brian ever had, a man called Joe Flannery, told me that, in fact, Little Richard was usually an absolute nightmare to put on anywhere, except at the New Brighton Tower Ballroom, because he'd spent the night with Brian in the Adelphi Hotel the night before.
Although Little Richard denied that when you asked him.
Well, in fact, I only asked him because years and years later I was doing a book tour in America, when you still could do book tours in America. And in the departure lounge of this very small airline, there was a bloke walking up and down with a dry cleaning bag and a little moustache, who wasn't particularly little, in fact, which he wasn't. That was Little Richard. And we were on the plane, this tiny plane, knee to knee. And Little Richard was terrified of flying. And as the plane took off, he started, "Oh, my Lord, help me, God, help me. I'm so sorry. My sins, I confess." He confessed to me that he masturbated 12 times a day. This is not that you usually get told on a small domestic flight in America.
Well, you'd hope it wasn't a very long flight. So
But he finally calmed down. He had an economy-sized box of tissues. He went all the way through.
I'm sorry, don't go. No, stop it.
Because we could see into the cockpit of the plane. The pilot's door was open, and there was like a stirrup hanging up. And the plane hit some turbulence, and the pilot's hand went and grabbed the stirrup. So he knew when the oh, this cat's only on page 3 how to fly. So finally, when the plane leveled off, I said, could I ask you something? Oh, sure, anything you want. On the night of January the 7th, when you appeared at New Brighton Tower with the Beatles and all the other Merseyiacs, had you spent the previous night in suite number 30 of the Adelphi Hotel with Brian Epstein? There was a very, very, very long pause. In fact, I had reduced him to silence. And then he said, no, 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 no. I never even had a sandwich with Brian. I thought, that's my next question. That's true. I still wonder about that.
We all know that Brian had never heard of the Beatles when a young man called Raymond Jones came into Lems to buy My Bonnie, the record they'd made in Germany. And Brian, piqued by interest, goes down to the cabin. And that's in Brian's autobiography. It's completely documentary true, isn't it?
Not at all.
No, I didn't.
Not a word of it. No, not a word of it. There was an absolutely crucial figure in the Liverpool scene at this time. There's a young fellow art student with John Lennon called Bill Harry. Bill Harry decided there were so many bands in Liverpool, he said there were 350, of whom the Beatles were by no means the best regarded at all. They were generally thought by many as the worst group in Liverpool at the time. But Bill started this magazine or newspaper called Mersey Beat, get it, Beat, and Beat, journalist Beat music. And he came round and asked Brian to buy some copies. And Brian questioned him closely about all the, what was going on in Liverpool, about the Beatles. He knew about the Beatles from Bill Harry. He knew they were playing in Hamburg and coming back and forth. And Brian ordered a dozen copies.
And the Beatles were on the front page of issue 1.
Yes.
So it's hard to miss.
No, but still, later on, Brian really sort of wanted to edit out anyone who'd been particularly helpful to him. And but for all through that particular summer, when the Beatles were coming and going to Hamburg, they were filling Mersey Beat. And Brian had a record review column where he conscientiously tried to sort of think about pop records and what the customers might buy in his department. And they were often on the same page. But he then said he hadn't heard about the Beatles until this Raymond Jones walks in on a Saturday morning when Brian is taking a turn behind the counter.
He didn't want to give credit to anybody else.
Almost no one else. I mean, people, like they've had several people who were sort of their managers before, who were, airbrushed out of the picture. All I would say is that the purely fictitious element of this fable is always thought to be Raymond Jones, the one who, he said, came and asked for My Bonnie by the Beatles. There was a Raymond Jones. I've actually talked to the real Raymond Jones.
Was he buying something by the Shadows instead? No.
With Brian Poole, the tramp.
Yeah. You do speaking of Brian Poole, you do a very, very good job of clearing up a fairly murky story of how come the Beatles got shoehorned into parlophone. Again, it's been mythologized to death. What actually happened?
Well, Brian, because of his prominence in the amount of business he brought to record companies in London, which there were not very many, of course, in those days, could easily go to the largest one, as he thought, which was Decca, and saying, I am one of your biggest retailers and I have this group I want you to see. But in fact, even then, he got into the executive's office by rather sleight of hand by saying he wanted to discuss their policy on returns. And then suddenly whips out the information. He has this group. And they're given an edition on New Year's Day. They have to come down to London. Snow is on the ground. It's that terrible winter. But it doesn't go at all well. And that is the only time, really, when Brian told them what to play. And he really told them all the wrong things.
The Sheikh of Araby.
Sheikh of Araby, yes. And
Besa de mucho.
Yes.
Chacho boom.
Red Sails and Sons, yes. And so they two groups auditioned that day. The other one, led by a young butcher from Dagenham called Brian Poole and the Tremolos. And Brian Poole get the contract.
Because they're local.
Because they're a bit more Dagenham is a bit more local than Liverpool, and Liverpool up to this point has been thought to be beyond comprehension, particularly for any musical.
Now, later, of course, they've been tried on all the EMI labels, of which there are 4, except Parlophone because George Martin's on holiday, and they get in not because they're a great band, but because somebody wants to publish the songs.
That's how it happens originally, yes. Ardmore and Beechwood, it's just EMI's publishing company. And so Brian is actually sort of has gone to the EMI, to the HMV store, which was then in its glory as it is now, and by accident gets it, introduced to this publisher. But he wants them to be signed as artistes, of course. And he eventually does get George Martin's position, this wonderfully gentlemanly man, absolutely seemingly immaculate man, is actually in bad odour within EMI, which has these 4 different satellite record companies, because he's having an affair with his secretary. And they were like the BBC. They were that, snobbish and sclerotic in their thought processes. And so, but also, he has given this group to record, thinking they're impossible.
As a punishment.
It's a punishment, yes it is, yeah. But what happens is, and the British class system is at the back of nearly all of this story, Brian speaks in this very lovely cultured voice with a little bit of Liverpool at the edges. George Martin has been in the war in the Fleet Air Army, although he came from a poor family, has acquired a lovely posh accent, and they just get on the level of they seem to be of a slightly higher social level than Goodh's little Watlins. So that's how it happens. Once it happens, of course, they're made for each other, because Martin seems to be the least likely person to a rock group to beat the band, because he has previously specialized in comedy records and he's a trained classical musician, which is what makes him absolutely right for the job, of course.
Because it was no ordinary band. You say in the book that George Martin thought, well, every time you do a comedy record, you have to invent it from scratch. But if I'm doing rock and roll, I can just knock them off. He made a mistake there, didn't he?
It was like, because his fellow label head at Columbia had Norrie Paramore. I don't think that was his real name. Who had Cliff Richard and the Shadows, which they just came out like this continuous veal and ham and egg pie.
Cookie cutter.
Yes. And George had to build up, if he was doing Peter Sellers or the Goons, he'd build it up from scratch. So he got something a bit better than Cliff Richard in the end.
We must talk about what is perhaps the most notorious event in the history of Brian's association with the Beatles, which is that by the time they're becoming fantastically famous, John is married, and because Julian's on the way, and there's a break in the Beatles' schedule, very briefly, and of course John would naturally have taken his exhausted wife and new baby away
For a bit
on
of
holiday. Yes,
bonding.
Bit of bonding. What did he do?
He went off with Brian for 2 weeks to Spain.
Eccentric.
Yes. He admitted he was a right bastard, which he could be.
He said the holiday was planned, whereas the baby was unforeseeable.
That's right, yes. Years later, John, to the unshockable woman he spent his last years with, namely Yoko Ono, told Yoko what happened. He said, well, I tried it twice with Brian. First time to see what it was like. Second time to make sure I didn't like it.
Thing is that John Lennon often said what sounded good at the time. We don't even know if that's true.
It has the ring of truth
Yes.
to me.
It does.
It does, yes. And because it was Yoko. And this is by the by, but why she was so like John is that they would answer any question that was asked of them. And he wouldn't have prevaricated with Yoko, I don't think.
It was fantastically reckless of Brian to go away just with John on holiday. It was bound to occasion gossip.
Well, I'll tell you, it could have wrecked everything. They were not they were having hit records. They were not by any means, certainly not world famous, not even countrywide famous then. And when they got back from this holiday, even the Mersey Beat, which was covering the musical scene, said nothing about this holiday, as you can imagine. And the only reference to it that was made was at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party, when the DJ from the Cavern Club made a waspish reference to John about his Spanish honeymoon, to which John responded by attacking Bob Wooler. He was a much older man, psychologically quite vulnerable, never really recovered from this awful attack, really. I knew him very, very well. But Brian's brilliance, having been so rash and so unwise, was that he'd taken on a man called Tony Barrow, who had contacts in Fleet Street. Tony Barrow got a friendly journalist on the Mirror to write up the story of John is so contrite. I beat up my best mate, Bob, sorry. I'm so sorry, Bob, I was high, which then meant drunk. How can you forgive me? And so, amazingly enough, now, if that had gone into the papers, if any other journalist had looked into that, they would have found out that Brian was gay and that he had a group of very young men that he was managing. That would have been the end of them and the end of him. But it amazingly nobody followed it up. It didn't happen. So then, immediately after that comes Beatlemania, which wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Which is a chilling thought.
Yes, it is.
So Brian was, we acknowledged, in love with John, but there were 4 Beatles. How did he feel about the other ones? You say that Paul was the one he most wanted to impress.
Well, because there were he was really on 2 levels with the Beatles. He regarded the Beatles as his children. The things he did for the Beatles, I mean, no other manager had ever done or would ever do. He protected them like his children, as if they were, because, he couldn't, as a gay man, he couldn't get married and he couldn't adopt. He wouldn't be allowed to adopt children, so they were his children. And he built this, while George Martin looked after the music and the development of the music, Brian was constructing this really sort of invisible shield around them to protect them from a fame that was literally terrifying. Could have torn them to pieces, literally to pieces.
Nearly did in the Philippines.
It did, and it very nearly did. That was just a bit of, it would have been far worse than the Philippines, and that was what Brian did. So, but John, it was like sort of scar tissue with John. It could open up again at any time, right until the end. And John, when Brian was having, deep trouble with pills and going into the Priory, John was the one of all the Beatles who sent him flowers. And he completely collapsed into tears, and he so loved John, and that John should think of doing that. It devastated him.
This business of erecting a shield around the Beatles went further, did it? Into real micromanagement. When George meets Pattie Boyd, who he eventually marries, Brian has organised down to the finest detail their first date. That's unusual.
Little Pattie tell you about.
Yes. That's right, isn't it, Pattie?
He did. And he came with us.
I came with you.
Just to make sure everything was going to be all right.
How old are you at this point?
20.
20. And this bloke comes on your first date with this man you're interested in.
So amusing and entertaining.
It's a Garrick.
And yes, and George and I are both very shy. And this was
It gave you somebody to talk to.
well, parts of, yes. This was a club that Brian was a member of. And so we couldn't have gone there without him.
Because women couldn't use the staircase.
But Brian knew what we should order, what chateau wine we should choose, and things like that.
And then
Education.
the weddings, Ringo and Maureen's wedding, he stage managed as well, and all of those.
And John.
And John's, of course, yes. But of course, the other side of that is that he was probably the only honest pop manager in the business.
He really wasn't in it. He didn't need money at all.
As a manager, he did make a couple of mistakes. He's always given a hard time for the American rights, for the merchandising rights. Although, in a way, that wasn't his fault, was it?
Well, it was his fault, unfortunately, as it was. Merchandising in this country really hardly existed. sort of you could buy replicas of glove puppets seen on children's television. That was about the Mr. Turnip or somebody. That was but in America it was a very serious business, and it could have been like another Disney. They were going absolutely crazy for anything to do with the Beatles in America after 1964, and he gave the job of apportioning the merchandising and also the retailing rights to a group of English blokes.
So he delegated it, though,
Yes,
didn't he?
yes. They were going to get 90%, and Brian was going to get 10%. Beatles were going to get 10% of Brian's 10%. And that really was a terrible misstep. And really the resulting litigation sort of was overshadowed him really for the rest of his life. It just these lawsuits went on and on about this.
And then he got messy because he started trying to do deals outside of this, and some American manufacturers were going bankrupt because
That's right. Well, yes, the places like big department stores, in particular like Macy's or J.C. Penney's, didn't know which were the right licenses, whether it was the one Brian offered them or this company who were called Celtab, Beatles spelt backwards.
Yes.
One of whom was actually an Earl. He was the Earl of St. Germans. So all these businessmen were coming up with, "Hey, listen, Earl, I'll talk to you." And so they just cancelled orders worth something like $78 million, which then has some bearing on later on his death.
we'll come to that. I just want to before we move on to him as a manager. Of course, having got the Beatles, he takes on Cilla Black and Jerry and the Pacemakers, and it's a brilliant success. But he can't stop. He keeps signing acts, many of which. There's a chapter in which he says he continued to sign up new acts almost as a reflex. The New Christie Minstrels, the Silky, Paddy, Klaus and Gibson, the Rustics. Now, the main thing about all of these acts is that you've never heard of them. Neither have I. He signed up a lot of ones that didn't work out.
Yes, well, George Martin told me he thought he was Diaghilev in the end. But
There's only one Nijinsky, though, isn't there?
yes, he's in the stands. Yeah. So, yes, he Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, who is a very good-looking boy. He calls him My Billy. He never talked about My Beatles. He talked about My Cilla, but never My Beatles, but My Billy as well. And Jerry and the Pacemakers, who were the good boys of Hamburg. They never broke up any nightclubs in Hamburg. And of course, before the Beatles, they had 3 consecutive number ones. It was the only joke that George Martin ever told me. The only one that made him laugh. He said, I called it his Jerry At trick.
Oh, yes.
He always laughed at his own joke so many times.
He's having a hard time in 1966 because the Beatles stopped touring for various reasons. He knows that in late 67, his management contract is coming up. Is expiring with the Beatles. And Brian becomes depressed and erratic. And of course, eventually dies. Where do we trace that back to? Where did the rock set in?
I think it's because it was pills with Brian, which they got him on these things originally called Preludin, slimming tablets. The Beatles found out about in Hamburg, which meant you didn't need to sleep, and that really was sort of the start of Brian getting messed up. He was a heavy drinker as well, but he knew that the management contract was running out in 67, and he did actually say to Larry Parnes, who actually became a sort of mentor to him, that they were going to give him notice. He thought that would be true, but still, this was like an enormous world tour in 1966, which started in what was then West Germany, then went to Japan. And then to the Philippines, and then there was a break, and after the Philippines, it went back to America. And it was a pretty sort of mad schedule, and when they got to Japan, they found that because they were playing in this martial arts hall, which was a holy place, the Budokan in Tokyo, there were death threats out against them. But after that, they thought they were going to have at least a little respite. They're going to the Philippines, which have this lovely... So it's actually the biggest grossing engagement of the whole tour. They didn't realize that Brian, after they were roughed up and manhandled in the British Embassy in Moscow on their Washington, on their very first trip to America, he made it a firm rule they would accept no social engagements. He wasn't aware that the wife of Ferdinand Marcos, the despot of the Philippines, Imelda, had invited him to a reception on the morning of the concert. And they didn't know about it, and he didn't until there was a knocking on his door, and it was two Filipino army officers saying they'd come to take him to the First Lady's reception, and he wouldn't let them go. And the actual performances went very, very well. They were leaving straight after that, but in the hotel, they suddenly found they couldn't get room service, they couldn't get anyone to carry their bags at the airport. They were roughed up. All of them were roughed up. They almost weren't allowed to take off until Brian had paid this enormous bribe to get them. It was called income tax.
Yeah.
But they did actually manage to leave, and that was really what turned them against it. Then after that, they had the American tour when they thought they were sort of going back to a very, very predictably welcoming audience. Unfortunately, this took Brian by surprise as much as anybody else. He'd given an interview to the London Evening Standard, Maureen Cleave, where he just volunteered a comment which attracted no attention at all in Britain, that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. It was picked up by a teenage magazine called Datebook and plastered all over America. There were death threats, there were riots, the Ku Klux Klan, they had to hide in the back of Wells Fargo armored trucks. And that was the clincher. There'd be no more.
So no more.
I just sort of finish off the American tour, which ends, which is their final live performance, which is Candlestick Park in San Francisco. And Brian has had this disastrous boyfriend in London who he actually signed up as an actor to NEMS and with a retainer. Was actually abusive and violent, but thank goodness disappeared back to America, but then reappeared during the Beatles tour and stole Brian's briefcase. And instead of watching the Beatles' last performance, he had to be trying to get his briefcase back. And that always was a mark of terrific remorse for Brian. And that really was the end of them as a performing act.
So we're back in London. He's had a fairly up and down time, and eventually he's died. I wanted to explore that just a little bit. You're contemptuous actually of the coroner and the pathologist in the inquiry because they clearly had made their minds up before it started. What do you think happened?
Well, let's go back to when they don't need his 24-hour, 24/7 care and attention. In fact, that he made a resolve not to interrupt them while they were making the Sgt. Pepper album. They would been happy to see him. He just thought he shouldn't. And he was among other things a gambling addict. And he was losing huge amounts of money at chemin de fer. And in fact, that was when the Cray twins, who were London's biggest crime bosses in those days, conceived this plan that they might be able to take over the Beatles. First they had some compromising photographs of Brian. Then they hatched a more elaborate plan of trying to rig the chemin de fer game at the Claremont Club, later notoriously the place where Lord Lucan disappeared from. And Brian would have to sell them a stake in the Beatles. Unfortunately, that never came to pass because, of course, he died. But he was in this sort of state of limbo. Although, strangely enough, the Sgt. Pepper release, although he was on a sort of taking day releases from the Priory, the drying out clinic, he was actually much closer to the Beatles at that point than he had been for a long time. The press reception for the album was at his house in Belgravia, where an American photographer was first seen talking to Paul McCartney. Linda Rees-Smith. Yeah.
Linda Rees-Smith.
That wasn't going to be his problem. But then he's really on pills, and he has his suits made with a little pocket just here, so he can convey a pill to his mouth in a quick movement.
So it's possible that he inadvertently overdosed. Reggie Cray suggested that he might have been murdered.
Well, the suggestion had come out long before that, far back when I did my Beatles biography, Shout, because I knew the person who'd run the company, the Cell Tab company in New York. And Brian was astonished when this man handed him a check for his share, his 10% of the royalties. He thought it was his full payment. He couldn't believe it. They were making so much money. This man, who was called Nicky Byrne, told me way back then that one of the manufacturers who had set up his whole factory to produce Beatle bubblegum or plastic guitars, his order was cancelled, and he was under such stress he had a heart attack and died. And his son vowed to take out a contract on Brian. I knew that from long ago, but more happened to support that idea as well.
Do you think there's anything in it?
I think there is. Firstly, because if you lose someone a lot of money in America,
They can get ratty.
they can get upset. Also, the Cray twins were like the mafia's London office. They were very proud of the fact that their firm did jobs.
So Reggie would know.
Reggie would know. And Reggie said to Peter Trollope, when Brian's body was found, or long after that actually, when they were talking about it, it wasn't us.
Chilling.
Yes.
I want to let the rest of you get involved now, and we could kind of keep on talking Brady's. But does anybody have any questions that they want to bring? Yes, please.
Okay, I'd like to know where you got to chat with Paul McCartney in researching this particular book, because you were saying Brian has never been given the credit he deserves, and I wonder whether McCartney feels badly about it.
I did get to chat to Paul McCartney, but Paul McCartney, his raison d'etre is really Paul McCartney, to our great benefit, I may say. I don't think it really even. He has since said, and all of them at different times did give Brian due credit. And it wasn't that Brian himself took most of the credit, but he did get credit from the Beatles when they were such as they were.
I was just wondering, with Brian, was he stars gay stars in the 60s weren't comfortable with their sexuality, like say Kenneth Williams? Do you know if he was comfortable with his sexuality, and did that inform like the masochism that he sort of inflicted in his head? And do you think that, because I think he died prior to the when
Just after it. As I said, had a month or two, but
He was still outside the law to his particular taste, unfortunately. He was never comfortable with it, no, and he came very close to coming out in an interview that he gave, actually not long before his death, but never admitting it, of course, no.
You mentioned how Epstein felt about Beatles, but how did the Beatles feel about Epstein? Did they appreciate the sort of protection he gave them, or did they feel resentment or conflict?
They didn't really appreciate it until he wasn't there anymore. And I mean, there were a lot of sort of projects hanging in the air, mainly the Magical Mystery Tour. And in the days after, when the Magical Mystery Tour was just disintegrating into total chaos and anarchy, many, many times the same words were said. Brian would never have let this happen.
you do say in the book that, well, of course, John famously said, well, we've had it now, when he was told.
I was saying, we're fucked.
He did say. You say in the book that Paul was the one who needed him least. Paul was the most self-sufficient Beatle.
Well, he was really, of course, he still needed Brian, particularly in the early days. Brian always, it was put to me by Shirley Arnold, who was the great sort of the person who ran their fan club and who worked for Brian and knew them all terribly well. He snogged most of them actually on the quiet. She said Brian always felt guilty because he didn't fancy Paul.
Oh, and you said he was grateful when they brought Ringo in because he wasn't good looking.
Yes, not someone else to break his heart. Really.
Yes. Yeah. Any more questions?
So you said that Brian, during his own lifetime, obviously didn't get the recognition that he deserved. And now, obviously, this book and it's actually Liverpool is starting to get that. How do you think he will feel about the book you've written?
I hope he would have me into his office and be incredibly smooth and charming and thank me very much, if I'm honest.
Have we any more questions? Well, in that case, we will say the book is Mr. Moonlight, Brian Epstein and the Making of the Beatles by the great Philip Norman, which is published by Simon & Schuster at £30. I'm going to ask him to sign the copy I've read, and if anybody has bought one or is going to buy one, I think I'm right in saying you'll be happy to sign it for them.
No, of course.
Oh, no. Thank you very much, and most of all, thank you, Philip.
Well, it's a bit baby.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.